From lecture halls to dining halls, college is an opportunity to learn new ideas, connect with new people, and start building a future.
I chose to go to NYU for all the incredible resources the school has to offer.
That's why I chose Drexel, because, when I toured their campus, I was like, this is awesome. This is exactly where I want to go to school.
But now, the college experience is far from what students expected or what they paid for.
I have student loans, and I'm paying now for what was supposed to be in-class learning.
It's just kind of wild to think that we have to pay $55,000 for basically the same thing you could find on a Coursera or edX for $50 or $30.
And not all majors are created equal when it comes to online learning.
I'm in a physics course that has a lab along with it, but I also had an internship with the anatomy lab on campus, and we're lucky enough to actually work with real human cadavers. So we haven't been able to do that.
Theater is about intimacy. It's about that in-person connection, and it's about detail. That professor needs to be able to see every minute detail of what that person is doing.
Many say they want their money back, and some are even filing lawsuits. Like GRAINGER, RICKENBAKER.
Shortly after, we all got kicked out of the dorm, we all felt the same way, that we're kind of not getting the experience that we're paying for. And, that's when I decided I needed to take action, kind of stand up for myself and my peers.
WILLEY represents GRAINGER in a lawsuit against Drexel University. His firm has 12 pending lawsuits for tuition reimbursement.
Do you anticipate that list is going to get longer?
Yes, we are receiving hundreds of inquiries from students and their families across the country, and we are investigating dozens of other potential suits.
What is at the center of these lawsuits?
These lawsuits are about fairness. The students bargained for certain services and access to facilities, paid for them up front, and are not receiving them, and so are due some of that money back.
Beyond lawsuits, there are now thousands of student-led petitions. They're gaining traction with peers, but not so much with administrators.
Once I hit around 10,000 signatures, I believe, I reached out and I emailed them a couple times, but no response yet.
At NYU's renowned Tisch School of the Arts, where tuition runs around $70,000 a year, the dean did respond and went viral.
For some students, they saw as, oh, that's Dean Green doing her thing. Other students did not take it well.
But while students are struggling with uncertainty, so are schools.
What is at stake for these universities?
I think what's at stake is, at a very, very base level, do they survive? I think just like for students, it's making them question what's the value of college. It's making colleges question, why do we exist? What's our purpose? So I think the colleges that are able to adapt and be creative are the ones that are going to survive. But I think it's going to also open up this conversation about what college is for.
We should note NYU tells us it is taking other steps to ease financial burden, like refunds on housing and meal plans and refunding certain course-based fees. The school also released a statement that reads in part, class discussion is carrying on, coursework is being assigned, student work is still being assessed, academic credit will still be awarded, and students are still making progress towards their degrees. And Drexel University in Philadelphia released a statement saying its top priority is the health and safety of its community and students, and they will continue to have access to academic offerings and support.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.